question out there, do we want to be proactive or do we want to be reactive on how it happens? Many times over the years, we heard locations of estates, and that's certainly no different today than it has been in the last years. So as some of you know, I come from a ranching family, which is just west of Lloydminster. So in working on that operation with my brother predominantly, we have gone through the whole family succession piece ourselves. And so a number of years ago, it was passed down to my brother, myself, from my parents. Feels like that was only yesterday. And now today we're sitting at the table with my kids, who are all young adults, and ready to say, okay, what happened next? So there's definitely been many experiences over the years that I've had in that process. My dad has passed away. I feel like he gave us a gift because he was very open with the process of trying to figure it out. And so I think a bit of that can be passed on, the pay it forward, that I can help some other people make that process a bit easier. I really want to do that. And so that is another piece of what I do off of our operation, is work with families that are trying to figure these pieces out. And I think another part of it is we look around and we see these family operations and we think, oh, jeepers, those people seem to have it figured out. Or we look at that, geez, they seem to have it figured out. But you know what I've learned? The truth is, nobody's doing it perfectly. And we all will have this and bumps along the way. So trying to figure out about how we can come together and start creating that vision and talking about important pieces of it. Another piece that I often reference, and it comes from a friend and mentor of mine, David Irvine, who's really gifted it. He refers to himself as the leadership navigator. He talks about that us farmers are really good at producing. That's where we excel at, but we're not good at the people side of things. And we need to start practicing and just work on it a little bit more to get that moving along. Another bias I have that comes from our own experience is there are a lot of other professionals that need to be processed, as you guys know, and many of you have maybe already talked to some. You need a tax accountant, you need a lawyer. But the more I work with families, I'm realizing that they need to get back to the drawing board and sit down together and talk about what the possibilities are, because they get down the road sometimes with the professionals and then hit a wall because they haven't worked on the visions or the communication piece. So I think that that's really important to talk about those kind of things along the way. A few other points that I want to make, that sometimes we have ideas that just because we're related, we should work together. That's not true. Sometimes we should together with our family. And like I said, not all other families are doing a perfect job. Everybody's having their challenges. The process will be filled with ups and downs, just as life is. And we often take those people that are closest to us for granted and treat our acquaintances better. So that definitely clouds the picture. But if you just go to the first slide there, Hannah, it will show a picture of my immediate family. And then he will be our he is our fourth generation, Ben Reed. So, that even, as many of you know, that even sort of makes you feel like you got to hurry up a little bit more, because there are these other people that are coming along. So if you go to the, as I just slightly referred to in the first piece, in that next slide, Hannah, that an integral piece of it is having the family come together, develop that common vision. Sometimes falls under the area of strategic planning, but we need to have clarity of the destination. We can even start to plan the journey.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, No, it's okay. That's okay.
Okay, we're good.
Getting everyone on the same bus, so to speak. And when going through the process, sometimes we want to set aside the challenges and just get to that best case scenario. I've been in a couple sessions late where they ask the question, if you knew you could not fail, or if you had all the time and money in the world, what would your family operation look like? Some of the points here on this slide were developed by a fellow, Dr. John Fast, who has done some work with FCC in the area a number of years ago, talking about the importance of the common vision. And it helped unite the family around a goal that is larger than the family. It helps inspire, especially during difficult times, and motivates family members. So providing the family with a core set of principles and guidelines, and providing a change model, as well as the informing and guiding the individual growth and development of the next generation. On the next one, we see it's called The Golden Circle by Simon Sinek. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's a management expert that, as far as I know, has very little to do, if anything, with adventure. But he talks about the 3 layers of the circle, with the center being the why, the next circle is the how, and the outer circle is the what. And what Simon says is that the really successful organizations are the ones that spend time at the beginning or at the center of the circle, talking about the why do we do what we do. And, I think it's important to talk about that, and what are the values that we're basing this operation on, and what kind of vision do we have? A colleague of mine shares a story about the challenges he was having in the transition process working with his father. And they were having lots of disagreements and butting heads. But he says the situation vastly improved when they took the time to really talk about their vision and why they do what they do. He says they were disagreeing on the what or the how to do it. How should we feed the cows? How should we graze that paddock? And that was where they were running into some conflict. But when they got back to the bigger picture of why do we have this operation? Why do we have this farm or this ranch? And what do we want it to offer the other family members? And it seemed, he says that things definitely improved when that happened, for sure. And then I think it's helpful too to be able to, if you go on to the next one, Hannah, start talking about the purpose and what are the reason that we are doing what we're doing. And, if we were going through an actual succession planning, which would take much longer than the time we have tonight, we'd really spend some time talking about that and having people sit down and share what their vision is for the future of the operation. And then, what's the purpose of it? What do they want to be doing? But again, we want it to be bigger picture, not the details of what gets seeded to the North 40 or those type of things. It's really a big picture conversations. And then another element that's quite important when we're talking about is the roles and responsibilities that we have in our operations. And on the next slide, it shows the 3-circle model, which they use a lot in family business. And this doesn't just apply to farm or ag operations, it applies to any family business. But what it really goes to show is that depending on which circle we're in, and some of us are in more than one, we have a different role to play. And more importantly, we have a different perspective. So trying to understand, number 8, other people that are not as involved, or in number 1 are people who who are involved in the ownership, but they are not family members and they're not involved in the conduct of the business. That might be a landowner that you rent land from. Number 2 is family members who have no ownership in the business and they do not work in it. So it could be an off-farm child, it could be an in-law of one of the ones. People in category number 3, they work in the business, but they're not owners or family members. And then number 4, those that are family members who have ownership, but they're not employed by the business. Number 5, as you can see, is people who have ownership and work in it, but are not family members. 6 are the family members who are working, but have not got ownership rights. And number 7 is those that have family members who have ownership and work in the business. So, without drilling down into all those different combinations, it just goes to show that depending on what hat you're wearing, your perspective and your desire for seeing how the business runs is different. And it also gives us an opportunity to talk about the decision makers and who actually in different situations has the veto power in certain decisions. So again, even though the circles might be separate, you can see in many cases they do overlap. Another question that we often ask or have people think about is, when it comes right down to it, which is more important to your situation, the family or the business? There's no wrong or right answer to this, but it helps give clarity when people are not on the same page. Another way of looking at the different roles is who's in charge of what areas. There is a model that a fellow by the name of Ernesto Ciroli developed, and he divided it into the production model, the finance area, and the marketing area. So thinking about, is there certain areas where people, that's their responsibility and they do the work in that area? And taking a more formal approach, I think sometimes because we're a family business, areas overlap and we don't always be as formal as we might be if we were in a different business. I see this sometimes with children who've left and worked off of the farm in perhaps for a bigger company, and then they come home and at the other place they had a job description, some of those kind of things. And I think it's important that we start looking at some of those possibilities as we move forward. Of course, the next one we think about is, how good are we at communicating? I think most of the time, as I referred to in the beginning, we're not always that good. I heard a saying the other day that I thought was good. There's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. I saw an interview with Tom Hanks recently on his Mr. Rogers role. And one thing he shared, that he had learned the acronym, and the acronym is WAIT, WAIT. And it stands for, why am I talking? And I think that that's something that we can often use, especially in our family communications, which are likely going to need to be worked on a bit and developed. In our family, I know listening is certainly something we can improve on, and I suspect many are the same. There's lots of opinions and people are vocal in our family, and getting a word in edgewise is sometimes tricky. Another thing to think about in this area is conflict and how we deal with it. I think there's some general ideas out there that conflict is just a bad thing. I know I personally try to avoid it, but recognizing that can be a powerful conversation to get us to move forward to better solutions, because it's 2 different sides being represented. But again, probably ground rules need to be laid. Patty Durand is a transition specialist with farm credit. And she recently shared on a webinar some important pieces with around conflict. And one is, if there is a lot of conflict, or if there is a conflict breaks out, it's important to pause. Because what happens when our emotions are elevated and we're in that situation is that our brains shut down. So sometimes, honestly, things will get too heated to actually pursue at that time. Other times, maybe it's better just to take the break and come back. Also, if there is some difficult conversations that need to be had, she suggests preparing for it ahead of time. Sometimes we aren't always able to articulate our thoughts, and her suggestion is to actually write them down. Write down the important things that you want to say. And in a family meeting, it's okay if you read what you've written down. She also suggests it's helpful to maybe run that by somebody. If there's another, I'm not sure if it should be a family member, but another friend perhaps, or colleague that you trust, to just say, here's some thoughts about what I want to say, and does it make sense? This is how I'm going to prepare it. So those are just a few tips for if things are getting more in a conflictual situation. And I think that definitely does happen. It's going to, it's just unrealistic to expect that we would agree all the time. So these are big issues that we're going to talk about, and we need to figure out a way to just keep moving forward. In the area of communication, I think it's important to start a practice of regular meetings. And if you just want to call them, we got to get working on our succession planning, that's what the meeting is going to be about. That's really a good way to do it. I think it's good to be inclusive and include as many people as you can. I know that isn't always possible, but it's a good way to start. But also let people set a date that works for people, and also make sure that as many can attend, and know ahead of time what to expect. This is, we've got to start having this conversation about the transition, as many of you mentioned in your intros. So the first thing we need to do is come together with a meeting. And start talking about those kind of things. Sometimes families have agendas so that they know ahead of time, this is what we need to talk about first. Maybe it's the land, maybe it's the management, one of those kind of things. Another tool that's quite helpful in the communication is to use a talking stick. So having people sitting in a circle is helpful. And then when a question is posed or we're wanting input, people pass the stick around. So of course the rule is, if you don't have the stick, you're not supposed to talk. That's good for situations where there's dominant personalities, but it also gives a chance for the quieter people to have their say and state an opinion too. So those are very helpful to think about when you are putting your meetings together. The next slide is what we call Gibbs triangle, and it is a process or a framework that I learned a long time ago. But in our teams, try to make sure that we're spending time at that bottom level, the foundation, and building trust. Sometimes there isn't always a lot of trust in teams, whether they're families or not, and working at ways so we can build that, because that helps make our communication better. It helps our goals to be more cohesive, and it also requires very little control. One of the things that I've observed is that many operations have that triangle upside down. So there's just a little bit of trust at the bottom, and then it just goes up from there. So a huge need for control at the top. I think one thing also that affects all these areas is our different intergenerational styles and the stages of life we're at. I know how differently I look at things when I am now in the parent and I'm not the founder, but a senior role and not in the successor or the child role. And it really does make a difference on how we view things. And I think it's important to really try to understand the other person's perspective, because we do get frustrated with, it might be the older generation with the hours that the younger generation want to keep. That's one example. Another really obvious one that happens daily in our world is the technology piece. And, I share a story about my mom phone and trying to get me to help her with her tablet over the phone, and, okay. And, but then the flip side of it is, an hour later, I'm phoning my kids and trying to get them to help me operate something, and they're rolling their eyes going, "Oh, Mom, how come we've told you how to do this? How come you don't know how?" So just keeping in mind, that I think as we get the older generation, our risk tolerance goes down a little bit. I think the younger generation, they're go-getters, they're enthusiastic, and they just want to go for it. And so we need to try to find balance. I was thinking of the bus analogy, where somebody's maybe pumping the brake, somebody's pushing the gas a little bit. And so making sure that we're ending up at the speed at which we actually want to travel, or that is appropriate for us. It's also important to honor all that has been built up by the founding generation. I mean, the blood, sweat, and tears literally that have gone into building these operations. I think it's sometimes hard for the younger people to really have a good sense of that. So sharing stories is a good way to do that. And then, they walking uphill to school both ways. I think that in generations to come, COVID of 2020 is going to be a legacy story to share with our grandchildren. But really, again, trying to take the time to understand the other people's perspective, the other member's perspective, and going back to those first questions about what is their vision for the future? What would they like to see? And, as we have those conversations, it's very likely that there will be some very divergent visions, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just then, as families, we have to start coming together to think about, can we put this all together into one operation that's going to work? Or maybe this is an appropriate time to figure out that it should be more separate. I think that, again, the operations are big that we've built. And I also know that there's the ideas of, we built this operation up and it needs to transfer more or less like it is. And I think one of our challenges as we try to incorporate the younger generation is to throw some of that out, that maybe these kids are smart, they're creative, and maybe they can come up with ways for modeling things or access to land that isn't quite what we're used to, but I still think it has a lot of potential for how it may work. A family that I worked with at Red Deer, they only have one child, and he is an artist in Vancouver. He's not going to ever be back managing that ranch. So they were able to come up with a transition that involved two other young couples. One of them, and they weren't related, they're non-family. One of them took over the livestock grazing end of it, and the other couple needed only a small amount of acreage to start a market garden. So I think, again, trying to come up with some of those interesting ways that isn't exactly how we used to do it is going to be an important part of how we move forward. As you hear time and time again, change is really the only constant, and trying to be open to change that is reasonable. And sometimes maybe it's a matter of letting the younger generation have some enterprises of their own that if they didn't succeed, it's not going to bring the whole operation down. But still, maybe it's a matter of using some land, machinery, whatever, some kind of shared resources that can be used as they move forward. And then another area of different roles is our different roles in the family. Is there a golden child, a black sheep? That has a huge impact on family dynamics and how others perceive the situation. Another role that gets lots of attention is the daughter-in-law. It's important to remember that we all operate from our family of origin, whatever that was like. And when everyone's family of origin was different. So when you come into another family, they will see things quite differently than probably what they experience themselves. And even having somebody to say, well, why do you do it that way? And, we have to stop and think, jeepers, we've been doing it that way for 30 years. I don't even know why anymore. So having those pieces challenged and ask some more questions, I think is an important part of our conversations. Another lens from which to increase understanding is the differing personality styles. Many of you will have done these before, and there's a whole lot of different tools and assessments out there, from simple to quite in-depth. One that I've used a fair bit is the color assessment, and there are simple questionnaires to fill out to discover your tendencies. Of course, nobody is completely one thing or another, but in this one, they have greens, oranges, blues, and golds. Greens are the logical and the analytical. Oranges are spontaneous, creative, outgoing. Golds like structure, order, and pay attention to detail. Blues are the emotional ones who emphasize relationships. So in our families, we'll have all of some of those different personality styles, and trying to understand the other's operating mode and how they work best is helpful in different situations. And I think there's great value in learning that. One of the ones that I'm mostly a blue-green with no gold at all. So going down the piece of details is really hard for me. But I also recognize in our operation, we need somebody to be looking after some of those details, especially in the bookkeeping side of things. So trying to get the balance and the mix. And then with the younger generation coming up, seeing what their skill set is and their passions, so maybe somebody does want, even though we haven't had sheep on the place forever, maybe somebody really does want to have a sheep enterprise, and trying to think outside of the box for some of those different opportunities that they really can have a stake in what's going on. And, there's so many different exercises and tools we can use to help create that common vision. One just example, in addition to the personality styles, is the SWOT analysis. So SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And that's a great topic for what really are the strengths of this operation, and hear from everybody's viewpoint. What are the weaknesses or rooms for improvement? How about opportunities? We're going through a pretty challenging time with COVID and everything from public health concerns, but there are opportunities to figure, as well as what are the threats. Easy to say that a threat for the cattle industry in Western Canada border got closed. So anyway, again, it's a good tool to start those sort of discussions, to get everybody involved and get their perspective on how things are going and how they see things. So when we get to the pieces about the actual steps for doing a succession plan, the step number one is to build that emotional bank account with the family. And so that means starting to have those conversations, trying to figure out who wants involved, who doesn't. There's a lot of stories, especially in Alberta, where young people left the farming operations for different careers, and then saying, no, thanks, we don't want to be involved in the farm. And then a few years later, turn around and come back and say, you know what? we've reconsidered. We'd like to be back at the farm. So that means a big change. And then trying to figure out how you're going to decide on your succession plan. Sometimes you might have a family member that is good at organizing and leading meetings, and they can lead this process. Sometimes you might have to get an outsider to just help you go through it. It's sometimes hard to wear the facilitator's hat if you're also a family member that has opinions from those different perspectives. And figure out how you're going to decide. Is it going to be a command from the senior generation? Is it going to be a consult? Is it going to be consensus that everybody agrees? That's a hard one to get everybody to agree. Or is it going to be convenience? What's the easiest? And again, there's no right or wrong way, but each of those ways has different advantages. And you'll have to come up in your own family with what is the best way to do that. Step 3, again, talks about appointing the succession planning leader or quarterback, a person who has the willingness and commitment to lead the succession planning process. Sometimes it might be your professional, it might be your accountant that has that skill set. It's important on the next one, as you'll see in step 4, that the succession planning leader meets with each member or the couples individually to get a good sense of what's going on. What are their hopes and dreams? Do they see any perceived challenges or roadblocks? And there's likely to be, there usually is. And then trying to bring everybody around the table together to talk about what the plan could look like. And everybody, again, is given a chance to participate and share their response and have questions and comments. And then once you come up with that, going back to one of my first comments, then it's the idea of sharing that data with the professional and the consultants for them to figure out the best steps to do it or a couple of options. It's really hard to do that reverse. And I know when we started the process, we were a bit guilty of that we wanted them to be telling us the best way to go forward. But really, the farming family needs to go and say, okay, this is our vision. These are the number of people involved. This one's likely to take over the operation, but another one would like to participate with some land ownership. We'd like to have agreements, between the siblings, or maybe there's the life insurance or some sort of personal wealth bubble that can handle the off-farm children. And again, this keeps going for a while. It does not happen overnight. And another piece of it is that, as I mentioned, you'd get to one point and then you're going to have to start all over again. So, but like the tree planting scenario, that it's always good to start it as sooner rather than later. This is one of the a favorite quote. That is my dad with 2 of his horses in that picture. And one of his favorite quotes was by Theodore Roosevelt about do the best with what you have where you are. And I think that for most of us, our situations are unique. Nobody's going to be the same, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. We're going to have different priorities. We're going to have different ideas about tax and land ownership, as well as legacy. The quarter that's with, the grandparents' house that was settled on it many years ago. All those factors implicate the process significantly. So, I think that at this point in time, I'm getting close. There's just a couple of, a few stories that I had wanted to share with other families that I've worked with. And one of them that I thought was really unique was, and I know 2 families who have done this, was the parents said to the kids, you guys figure it out. And so they sent the kids away to figure out how they wanted the farm passed on. In both cases, the kids came back with a plan, and the parents didn't quite approve of all of the pieces of it. So they sent them away, and then they came back, and the next plan was approved. So, in those ones, that's a big step, letting go to really let them figure it out. But you can put some different pieces on there for what the caveat or conditions might be. Another family I know, for their ranching operation, when their sons that were both involved in it got married, both of the daughter-in-laws received a share of ownership in the company as they were just along with their spouse. It was divided into 6, so there's a really welcoming way that family chose to go, to show that, once you're part of the family, if you so choose, you can really be part of the whole business as well. There was another situation with a blended family, and one of the daughters, there was 2 families that had come together. I think there was 5 kids altogether. And one of them lived close to the parents and had built a house on an acreage. And it was starting to cause a little bit of a rift, because there was some ideas that perhaps there was preferential treatment going on there. But when they all sat down together and the parents said, well, no, it's our wish that everybody can be provided an acreage or a spot to build a home if they so choose, it just completely changed the dynamics. Oh, okay. Some of them didn't even want to, but when everybody knew that was what the parameters were, they felt good about it, and that changed the situation. I think another important piece that everybody, and if this is the way you start the conversation, then so be it, but it's also one of the hardest, is talking about that seed plan. So when everybody's in a good space, being able to say, okay, at some point in time, I'm not going to be here anymore. And let's talk about how that's going to go before we are in the hallway of a hospital, or before we're sitting at the funeral home. And I know full well those are really, really hard conversations to have, but I also know they're way easier when all the chairs are full. And many of you will have known what kind of hardships go through that. But there is it's actually the family that provided the children with acreage opportunities. They joked about the grandpa had the black book, and that's where grandpa's will was, all the important documents, and the kids would joke to each other if they got into trouble. Oh, I think grandpa went to the black book and he might have done something about your name. But the idea that all of that is together with the important documents, so that if something happens, we have a lot of the bases covered. A dear friend of mine, Angie Fox from Manitoba, originally from around here, the Fox family, lost her husband Jay in a farm accident, when they were in their early 30s. And she does a talk now. It's called the Because I Love You talk. Just because some of those situations are so immensely difficult. And one of the pieces that she really values is how many conversations they had and how shared in the decision-making she was, so that she knew she had relationships with the bankers and the lawyers and the accountants. And that's another question I often ask, do you have a lawyer that you have a good relationship with? Do you have an accountant that you have a good relationship with? Back when we were first doing some of this work, and when it was getting a little bit more complicated, our accountant said, we need to pass you on to somebody that specializes more in this. And certainly a lot of the accounting firms have specialists in this department. But also thinking about, it's not only the senior, the parents' relationships with the professionals, but what about the kids too? Because it's good for them to know the bankers and the lawyers and the accountants. I think those are good meetings to take everybody along to. So, again, there's just so many different pieces and ways that we can do this, but, starting the process and figuring out how can we have those first conversations. So it's getting close. We're about 7 minutes away from 8 o'clock. So I did want to take the time, if there were people that had put any questions or you wanted to bring up some questions now, I'd be happy to answer that. Or Hannah and I can carry on with a discussion about some of the things that I commonly see. So if somebody, I guess, if somebody wants to ask a question, we'd have to unmute them if they're doing it that way, or if they were wanting to, and I can't see everybody, so that, or they can type a question in the chat box. But in the meantime, Hannah, we can carry on with our conversation, which we don't need to share the slide anymore.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Things repeating. Okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
I guess
one thing. I guess me personally,
how do you kind of
nudge the dad to maybe
that you want to take reins, I guess. That makes sense. That you're wanting to step
you're wanting to step into that role.
Yeah, I think that's a common thing, and there's so many elements of it, and one is to, as I referenced earlier, that's a big transition for many farmers and ranchers, because at that age when they're stepping out, that's probably all they know. And so to think about not being on the farm anymore, and so I think if you can start having conversations, and maybe I'd really like to get more involved, is there ways that can happen? Now, unfortunately, sometimes it's the response is, oh yeah, for sure that's going to happen, for sure that's going to happen, and yet it never does. So really trying to figure out, to have that conversation about, okay, in 5 years, like, how old is everybody going to be? Well, if the dad's 75 now, in 5 years he's going to be 80, and is the son 45 and going to be 50? Well, things are going to be different. And is there some ways, do you still want to be involved in the farm? Many will say yes. Well, what are some things that you would like to do? Well, perhaps, harvest. I like harvest. Is there a way that I can drive a truck or, be on the combine? For many, it's important where they live. That's a tricky conversation. Those farmhouses are the center of the farm, and trying to figure out a way to phase out. And I think, from the senior generation too, trying to find some things that are still interesting and engaging, whether you get involved in some local nonprofits, or it's hard to find hobbies when when your hobbies are likely on the farm, but maybe it's something to do with the horses or those type of things. And also I think another thing that can be helpful there is if the parents have some other friends or trusted people, that you might have a conversation with them saying, having some resistance with dad here. Do you have any thoughts? And maybe it's the lawyer, but another trusted person that could help you see it from the parents' perspective, but also start moving things on. That it is important. Again, going back to in 5 years. So, holy cow, if we were doing this right now, we'd be starting the sentence, by 2025, I will be how old? And the people around me will be what age? What will we be doing? And then carry on with, the farm at its very best will look like this. And then people can really start to talk about, well, maybe we've diversified. Maybe we've downsized, whatever, who's living on the farm, and starting to have some of those kind of conversations. Is that helpful to think about ways of moving it along?
Yeah.
And then I guess too, another problem that I come across is, how do you keep it fair between the siblings? Maybe as my brother, he'll probably want to take a more solid role than myself. So how do we kind of go through that process of maybe trying to keep it fair, but then understanding each other's needs? And
For sure, for sure. And I should mention Elaine Fraze. Many of you guys will have heard of her, and she does such great work in this. But in this field of succession planning, but one of the things that she really talks about is fair and equal are not the same thing. And honestly, if as a parent you think it needs to be equal, then honestly, that most likely means that you sell the farm, have a pile of cash, and divide it equally. But, that isn't the reality in many cases. So how can we be fair in it, right? And I've heard of some more people that are doing great work are Murrow Good and his daughter, Anessa. And one of the things is that, so maybe non-farming kids can have some land ownership, but having good agreements where they rent it back to the farming child at a fair market rate, and a way to establish that. And then if it was to sell, the farming child has a first right of refusal. Another way of doing that I've seen, where they actually put an agreement in place that if there is a piece of land and there's some concern that it might get sold, then an agreement is that, Hannah, if you got that particular piece of land and you turn around and sell it in 2 years, you have to share the proceeds with your siblings. So different things like that for it also those agreements can take into allowance, if there's special needs situations or something where you want to make sure that some of the kids are looked after in a certain way, and it can be put into a trust. And again, I should have told you at the very beginning, I'm not an accountant and I'm not a lawyer, but, there's a lot of creative ways to come up with this. And sometimes with the direct farm enterprises that these young people are wanting to start, they don't need a big land base. They might only need access to 40 acres. So, for a larger farming operation, that's not too much to be able to say, okay, that can be your allotment to do with as you wish. So again, it goes back to that sitting down and having those conversations about, well, how could I be involved? I heard of one the other day where it was a ranch in the States, and the son was there and very involved with his own welding shop on the farm, but he didn't have anything to do with the cattle. But yet he was still part of the family operation. So coming up with ways again to, or maybe it's going to be somebody that says, you know what, no, all I want is a space to be able to come back over the Christmas holidays and bring my kids or whatever, so figuring out that piece too is important, especially if the farmhouse has changed hands too, because not everybody has the open door policy. That's another one, about where should people live and how should that be best handled. So I mentioned David Irvine once before, and I have to mention him again. He talks about the seasons of life in the transitions and how the kids are born and they're very dependent and we need to do everything for them, and then go through the stage of independence where it's really like a breakaway. Parents don't know very much and you got to go do your own thing. But in our family operations, we then go to that next level of interdependence. So how can we work together? And so how can we, not only be a parent and child, but also business partners? Because again, those are different hats that we're going to be wearing. And even recognizing, like sometimes I'll say to my kids, okay, right now I'm wearing my mom hat and this is what I'm going to say. But then the next time, okay, we're working together on this one. This isn't my mom hat that I'm wearing right now, so just to clarify things that, to try to figure out the different ways. But you young people are just so, like I said, so smart and creative and want to have access to some land. There's a whole lot of young people in agriculture that don't have a family operation to come back to, and they give their eye teeth to be able to just manage it or have a long-term lease or something like that, where you can develop a relationship like that, nothing's set in stone for sure. And as we all know, life changes. But anyway, those are just some of the ideas and experiences that I have had along the way.
Were any
Sorry,
I think it's because was there any questions that came out of that conversation that you guys have now that are kind of burning before we carry on?
Not seeing too much. So one of the pieces that Hannah and I definitely did want to talk about is, and you don't need to reply right now, but I believe you have her contact. You have everybody's contact information, and you saw mine come up at the end there, or you can get it through Hannah.
Yes.
But if there was any interest in having some more of these conversations where we went into some more specifics, tonight was a really broad-based overview. These are some of the important pieces, but we can really spend a lot of time drilling down in some more how-tos. So I invite you, if you're interested, you can contact me or message Hannah, and we could set up another webinar to keep talking about and doing some work on this very important topic.
And then I think too, I'll send out an email within the next few days, kind of going over some of the other information that Kelly spoke to, maybe looking up Angie Fox or Ellen Fraze or, David Irvine, right? Like these might be other good resources that you can pull from. So, and another good way, if you guys are starting to think of, well, what are my farm goals, or, what do we want to see in the future? You can start an environmental farm plan. I can help you guys with that. It's kind of a self-assessment tool that identifies some of the risks or challenges you might be having on your farm and how you can improve that. So, a big one that I, am hearing about is, managing your water well. Like hopefully if you're, maybe thinking about, passing on the farm or going through that transition, you kind of want clean water. So like we kind of go over all those points in that too. And if you do get a farm plan, you are eligible for funding. So if that's one of your goals to make your farm more sustainable, there is, funding out there to help make your farm more sustainable too. So if you have questions about that, feel free to email me. And yeah.
And also, I should say that if anybody wants the copy of the PowerPoint, there's not very many slides in there, but if there was some, we're happy to share that with you, if that would be a help to guide some of your further conversations about what your operation is going to look like in the future.
So thank you guys all for tuning in. We really appreciate being able to host things like this. I think the more that we can help some of our ratepayers out with these burning questions, the better. So we're really happy to provide this, and a huge thank you to Kelly for making the time to do this and offering, some of your experience and stories with us. We really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, thanks everyone, and we will, you can stay in touch with us, and I hope the grass and the crops keep growing like they are right now, because it's an awfully good start. Take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
Bye.
What?
They're waving, yeah.
Oh.